Love to have you here. One of the wonderful things about Zoom is that it allows us to cross political borders and cultural borders and all kinds of borders. And you know, the sort of our unofficial motto at Let's Learn is everyone has something to learn, everyone has something to teach. And we're very excited by this opportunity to allow Daniel Maposa, who is a leading theater artist from Zimbabwe, to share with you the history of political theater and theater in general in his country. It's a very rare opportunity for us to have this conversation with him across all those borders I was talking about. Let me introduce him, and then he and I will have a conversation which will open to you for sure near the end, but at any time you want to ask a question or jump in, we encourage you to do that. So Omar, why don't you put the two of us on the spotlight so people can focus on us for a few minutes. Thank you. So Daniel Maposa has been active as an actor, a director, a playwright, and a producer in progressive, socially engaged theater since the mid-1990s in Zimbabwe. In 2006, he founded and is the executive director of Savanna Trust, a Zimbabwean-based arts organization that uses theater as well as film and radio and television to engender social change and development. Under the Mugabe regime, at great political and personal risk, he organized the Protest Arts Festival, which brought together progressive political performers and artists from throughout Southern Africa and beyond. In the years since, he has led the development of Savanna Trust from being what he calls, in his words, a hit and run street theater into a performance center that brings interactive performance and theater to villages throughout Zimbabwe, produces radio dramas, films, and television programs. Under his leadership, Savanna Trust has spearheaded the development of the Southern Africa Theater Camp, which provides an environment for the exchange of knowledge and skills and collaboration on a regional scale. He also the Right Zimbabwe Initiative, which offers 3-month mentorships in playwriting, and the Community Theater Capacity Development Program, which works with emerging community-based theaters, newer theaters, many of them inspired by his work, to develop their artistic and management skills. Daniel holds a master's in arts and culture management and is a doctoral candidate in the Cultural Policy and Management Department at the School of Art at Wits University in South Africa. Daniel is among those whose work I feature in my new book, Performance Activism. I don't know if you can see the cover. No, it's not. It's all blurry, but it's a good book, and we talk about his work in some detail in there. I first met Daniel when he came to New York to present at Performing the World, which is the biannual International Conference of Performance Activists that's organized by the Eastside Institute. The year was 2012, so we've known each other for 10 years, at least that's my calculation. And we were introduced by Betsy Pendry, a US-born lifelong performance activist who divides her time between Johannesburg and New Orleans. And we are very excited that she is here with us this morning. So I would, you know, the introduction that she brought about has allowed us to have this conversation and many other conversations over the last 10 years. And I think made a connection between the Savanna Trust and the Castillo Theater, and in a more general sense between the Zimbabwean political theater and political theater in the US. Betsy, Omar, could you bring Betsy, could you spotlight her, and Betsy maybe say a little something about all of this?
First of all, great to see everybody. Great to see you, Daniel, again. The thing that, I mean, I had the privilege of going to some of the protest arts festivals in Harare. Really an incredible experience to be with performance activists from around the world, but particularly from Africa and Southern Africa. So that was a wonderful opportunity, and have been able to be at some of the performances that Savanna Trust puts on in community centers. And one of the things that's been so striking to me about all of them is how it is that the performances they put on, but more than that, the dialogues that they host afterward, allow communities to come together and talk about really, really difficult subjects. The most recent one I saw, I think, was it in February, Daniel? I think it was about sex work. It was February, right?
Yes,
And
in February.
the thing that was so striking was the way that the performances enabled the characters to be very conflicted, and the conversation afterward just so moved me in terms of the dignity that everybody had and gave to each other in terms of listening to each other and being able to express themselves about really controversial issues. And so that's the thing that has stayed with me the most in terms of what Daniel's work and Daniel promotes, is bringing people together to make their own decisions and giving everybody and respecting everybody's dignity. So it's a privilege, Daniel, to see you here.
I'm happy to see you, Betsy.
Thank you, Betsy. We're going to return you to the gallery, but we will, feel free to speak up at any time, because you have, in terms of experiencing the work, Daniel's work, more than anyone else in this room, I think. So I would love you to enrich the conversation at any point. So
thanks, Dan.
Yeah. Okay, folks, what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask Daniel some questions, and then he'll respond. And again, there'll be time at the end for questions and comments, but we don't have to hold back. If you do want to ask a question while we're talking, rather than just interrupt, what we suggest you do is you go and raise your electronic hand, which you can do if you go down to the bottom of your screen where it says reactions, and then the bottom one under reactions is raise your hand, and then that puts your picture up to the front of the gallery, and we know you have a question at that point. So Daniel, and this conversation is really, in a way, two parts, but they're one story. We're going to start with the history of political theater in Zimbabwe before Savanna Trust, and then that will lead into Savanna Trust and how it's built on that history. So Daniel, Zimbabwe, and I'm not sure if folks in the United States realize this, has a rich history of politically engaged theater. Now, my knowledge of it, which is limited, begins with the Pukwe, and again, by the way, I apologize to any folks in Zimbabwe if I mangle the words in your languages, but the Pukwe developed during the War of Liberation, the war to overthrow the racist settler state, which took place between 1965 and 1980. So I want to talk about what the Pukwe was, but was there political theater before that during the colonial period? And if so, what was it like?
Thank you very much, Dan. And thank you for the introduction. I didn't know that I have that long history, and it sounded like you are introducing one of our ministers here. Yeah. But nonetheless, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Back to your question. Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to meet you, and I'm happy to be here today. But regards your question, was there political theater before colonialism? Let me start by saying performing arts in the pre-colonial era was more community-oriented and very participatory. So some can argue that because of its form during this period, it is usually not classified as theater, as it is known from a mainstream Western perspective. Mm-hmm. So if you listen very well, I started with the term performing arts. But from our perspective, from the African perspective, theater, and from the general academic perspective, theater is all encompassing music, dance, acting, and the like. So why do I say it was not classified as theater, but more performing art? Because theater as existed before colonialism was much more not based on aesthetics or performance-centered activity, but a participatory process in which all community members had a role to play. They co-created together, and this is the culture in Zimbabwean rural communities. Is still happening now. So the aspect of actor or performer audience is a new phenomenon. So in our tradition, we created together, we mobilized each other. And there was no director or actors or people classified as actors. The main actors within this process emerged organically during the performative process. So we would not say you are the main actor, you are the director of the show, you are the musician, or you are the lighting person. So the main actors emerged from the process during the performance. And theater then, or broadly performing arts, were done for social purposes, like celebrating a newborn child during a rainmaking ceremony or a good harvest. So this was theater as we know it pre-colonial. So let me say from the onset, nothing much is written about this form of theater. Most of the texts that I've encountered starts from the liberation struggle, and very little talks about pre-colonial theater.
Right.
Most of it is also from oral tradition.
Right.
So having said this, nothing much is also written about political theater in pre-colonial period. While there were just during a performance, for example, where a community member during a performance would retribute, for example, an errant community leader, it was not really classified as political theater. It's something that came out through a performance. So we do not plan that we are creating a political theater piece. It is something that came out organically out of the people, where through poetry, through song, through dance, they could say something out that they were not happy with. So, and you'd realize that as well, this is not so much written in books or in journals. So from my perspective, there is need to do some research into the thematic issues tackled in the performing arts pre-colonial period.
Yes. Yes, that definitely
Yes.
sounds like it needs a lot more research and a lot more respect around the world, which does bring me to this form called the pulque, because in some ways it was based on that traditional way of performing as a community, and it became if you will, a tool or a process in organizing folks during the revolution there. Can you talk about the pulque and what role it played in the liberation struggle?
Yeah, the pulque theater. Let me start by saying during the colonial period, theater institutions as we know them now, such as the National Theater Organization, which was the only board that was in existence during the colonial period, grouped together white-only theater clubs operating from playhouses that were built, for example, by the Beit Trust. We have them in Harare. One is called Reps Theater, the Repertory Theater Players, the Bulawayo Theater. So in every major city in Zimbabwe, there was a a performing house or a theater house that was built by the colonial regime. So, and as well as in mining towns, this was basically for the purposes of entertaining the white community who wanted to have a link between Rhodesia then and Britain. So they would do a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of Eurocentric plays. So these theater clubs focused on policies that encouraged a separate cultural life and perpetuated the colonial culture and hegemony. Traditional Black theater then was discouraged or was banned to include the Pungwes during the colonial period, as local performing arts were seen as a threat to colonial authority. So the colonial powers were then correct to be concerned about theater, because performing arts and the cultural beliefs greatly influenced the struggle for independence. So you'd realize from 1965 to around 1979, 1980, when elections were done, there were, when the liberation struggle was at its height, the freedom fighters in Mozambique, in Zambia, in Botswana, and other African countries like in Tanzania, and some liberated zones in Zimbabwe, started performing theater or the Pungwe theater at night as a way of boosting morale and as an educational tool to mobilize the masses to support the struggle. So this all-night theater entertainment or performance was called a Pungwe. But let me probably define what a Pungwe is. Pungwe is an P-U-N-G-W-E. So it's a Shona word which refers to an all-night vigil. This is where two or more people gather for a certain purpose. It might be for religious purposes, for funeral purposes, or for political, social purposes that happen throughout the night. The bottom line is that people gather all night for a common purpose. So this used to happen even pre-colonial, during colonial period and post-independence era. So it's sort of a cultural practice that happened within the Shona and the Ndebele and the broader Zimbabwean communities. So during the liberation struggle, the fighters then imported this cultural practice into the war of liberation as a way of mobilizing and teaching the masses around the ethos of the liberation, around oppression, around the need to liberate Zimbabwe from the Smith regime. So the Pungwe was accompanied by dances and war songs, which during the liberation struggle were called Nziyo the Chimurenga, or songs of liberation. And it has been described as having been a highly participatory form of cultural performance. So therefore, the Pungwe theater during the liberation struggle was a very participatory process. People mobilizing each other, acting together for the common purpose. And so the freedom fighters brought this already existing cultural practice of Pungwe and used it to mobilize, engage, and indoctrinate the masses for the common purpose of freeing themselves. So the people had to support the struggle. And one of the things which I think most of the early Zimbabwean performances borrowed from the Pungwe was the involvement of the so-called audiences. We call them audiences now, in the whole process, from mobilization to co-creation of the message. So while the freedom fighters were the main actors, the masses, the equally supporting actors who actively participated in the process. So in this Pungwe process, they co-owned the performance space. They all co-owned the political space, and they actively participated in organizing the event. So the success of the political messaging and the message was in active mobilization of the citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So this cultural practice that was then performed by the freedom fighters with the masses was so relevant to the people, as they could see themselves participating in a cultural practice, but at the same time learning more about the need for liberating themselves from the Smith regime. So some academics or scholars have argued that song and dance, in this case theater, won the war of liberation, as it managed to bring together the fighters and the masses to pursue a common goal, that of emancipation. So the use of the Pungwe methodology enabled the citizens to buy into the subject of liberation or emancipation. The people felt that here are we call them Vana, or the children, who understand our culture, who share our culture and our authors and our practices. And so we had to buy into it. Mm-hmm. And in contrast with the Smith regime, they did not want anything to do with Black theater or with Black performances. They had banned most of those performances. So it was easy to attract the masses to be on the side of the liberation fighters.
Yes.
Something possibly that I'll speak about later in our current context of the current Zimbabwean political theater, its successes and its shortcomings.
Right.
Juxtaposing it with the Pungwe during the colonial times.
And what happened with the Pungwe after liberation? How did it? What forms of political theater functioned in the 80s, for example, and into the 90s? I mean, I know of one grouping called Zambuko Izaboko, which is a name that drew from your two major languages, Shona and Indebla, which means, and both in the two words mean cross or ford a river. And I read that they chose that name because they saw themselves and Zimbabwe as poised to, and I'm quoting their mission statement here, quote, march across the river from colonialism, racism, sexism, and capitalism to independence and equality to socialism. And their work was inspired to some extent, I know, by the Pungwe. They began their plays with the so-called audience and the so-called actors dancing and singing together, and then they would tell a story. But could you tell us more about them and about what other theater happened in that period and how and why it didn't survive?
Yeah, so post 1980, when then Zimbabwe gained independence, there was emergence of dual forms of theater. The National Theater Organization that I spoke about earlier, which perpetuated the Western type of performances. And through government support, through what was called the ZIMFEB, Zimbabwe, I'm trying to think, it's an acronym for something, but it is something who's popular education. Mm-hmm. It was a program that was put up after independence in 1982 as a way of educating the masses around issues of socialism, around issues of health, around issues of development then. So there were then two camps: the urban-centric form of theater that was managed by the National Theatre Organization, and then the new form of theater that was also brought in by people like Ngugi wa Miri, who was brought from Kenya to Zimbabwe, of community theater. So after 1980, we begin to see a number of theater clubs emerging in Zimbabwe that include the Amakos Theater, the Zambuko Izibuko of 1985, which was formed when the theaters department was introduced at the University of Zimbabwe by students from it was not at a department, but it was a module by the student from the English department who formed a theater club at the university. And primarily some of their work, the Zambuko Izibuko, which was led by Dr. Robert McLaren and Stephen Chifunyise, who are some of the pioneering playwrights and people who established the theaters department at the University of Zimbabwe. They took the leftist side, so they were more inspired by socialism. So it was a perpetuation of what was happening and the ethos that were being preached during the War of Liberation, that of socialism. But then when Zambuko Izibuko was formed, they began to focus mostly on anti-apartheid plays. So they produced plays that denounced apartheid. They were very political in that way. They produced a play called Mandela, the Spirit of Liberation. They produced plays like Samora, in reference to Samora Machel, the first president of Mozambique, and many more political plays, but more of it was based on the need to promote Pan-Africanism, to promote the liberation, total liberation of the African continent. Then issues around, because we're just coming from independence, issues around performing against the new government were really not heard of, because everyone was happy with the attainment of independence, and you'd find that most of this work was in line with the government's policy, that of also liberating the remaining African countries, particularly South Africa, Namibia in Southern Africa. So you'd find them tackling those hard-hitting plays that were anti-colonialism, anti-oppression, anti-apartheid. You'd then realize that after 1994, when South Africa gained independence, and I don't know if it was a coincidence, whether it was a coincidence also, the Zambuko Izibuko, or because the former or the founding students left the university, you'd find that the Zambuko Izibuko began to fizzle out of the performance scene, and some of the performers, they formed their new groups, to include the founders Robert McLaren and Stephen Chifunyise. They founded the Children's Performing Arts Workshop in Zimbabwe, strictly focusing on children's plays. That is, to the best of my knowledge, how then Zambuko Izibuko disbanded, but you would find that they created a lot of leading performing artists in Zimbabwe, the likes of the world-renowned poet Albert Nyati. Tsitsi Dangarembwa was part of that crew as well, and many local writers in Zimbabwe were part of Zambuko Izibuko. So while they were studying theater, they also put it into practice. And this was a very vibrant group at the University of Zimbabwe, which also went into the communities, yes.
So that branch or development came mostly out of the university. There was another very important development in Zimbabwean theater around the same time, and that's the theater generated by Kant Miglanga. Again, correct my pronunciation. Yes. And I know that he was not a university student. He started out as a factory worker, and he wasn't even interested in theater. He was in a karate class one night, but when he went to the class, it had been rented to a theater troupe. So he sat around and watched and got very interested in theater. And he went on to have a great impact on Zimbabwean theater and political theater. Could you talk about his contribution?
Oh, Kondi Mhlaga, may he so rest in peace. He passed on in August. Yeah, and we had just planned this lesson. But he is one of the founding fathers of Zimbabwean political theater as we know it now. I think most of us were inspired by Kondi Mhlaga's work. So this was a karateka who used to work in a factory. So they were doing karate as a part-time. And then one day there were people who were coming to Bulawayo, Zimbabwe's second largest city, to do some training workshops on theater where they were practicing. So that is how he got into theater, according to him. So they started doing mixing karate and theater. But at the same time, there were conflicts in Zimbabwe. Early in 1982, where there was what we call the Gukura Hundi, where people were massacred by the Robert Mugabe regime. The people in the southern part of Zimbabwe, mainly the Ndebele people, in the pretext that they were dissidents in that area, and the people who the Matabeleland people were hiding dissidents in Zimbabwe. So this was an area where Kondi Mhlanga was coming from. So he became a very politically conscious young man at that time. And also he began to be very critical of the new government. Then it was around the aspect that because there was pronouncements of reconciliation in 1980, and what was being said in public and what was happening in practice was two different things. So Kond started producing plays that were very critical of the government and of the Zimbabwean society in general, of the relationships between the white people and the black people, but also the black people among themselves, the Ndebeles and the Shona and other ethnic groups. So he started producing critical plays, something that was never heard of. In fact, at that time, it was not expected that a black Zimbabwean would begin to criticize the Mugabe government. I think you would become unpopular between 1980 and 1990 for you to criticize Robert Mugabe. But Kondi Mhlanga took the bull by its horns. So he is one of his first plays that made him very popular was a play called Workshop Negative, where he was critiquing race relations as well as ethnic relations in Zimbabwe in the new Zimbabwean dispensation. So the government was not happy with this play, Workshop Negative. So this was one of his formative plays that gave him prominence, and it was denied clearance to be performed in Botswana and other surrounding Southern African countries. But one of the most important things then that happened was the aesthetics. So Conte departed from the socialist and the government parroting kind of plays of the early 1980s to becoming a serious critic of the government, of society, and also of the different races and ethnic groups that were in the country. But while the government was angry with Conte's contribution, the people loved his plays. So he would perform around the country, not only in his tribal region, to sold out performances. I think he was the first person to win the National Theatre Organization, first Black person to win the National Theatre Organization Play of the Year with Workshop Negative. So after 1985 or 87, when he produced the Workshop Negative, he went on to produce other plays like The Good President, which was banned, like Sinjalo, that was, and Double Up. Double Up was a play that was talking about young Zimbabweans skipping the border into South Africa to look for opportunities. And this was around 1989, 1990. And now we are talking about these issues now about illegal migrants in South Africa, illegal migrants in other countries in the world. And wouldn't you say that Conde Mhlanga was a prophet in that instance? He foresaw what was happening. He foresaw the misrule that was happening early on before anyone else saw what was happening with the Mugabe regime. So most part of his life was committed to creating political plays that spoke about issues of concern to the Zimbabwean citizens. He didn't mind being unpopular. He didn't mind getting support from the government, because early on, most of the support was coming from government. Like you would realize the formation of the Zimbabwe Association of Community Theatre was propelled by government funds and through the ZimFab, which brought in Ngugi Miri. So he went on a tangent. And in the 1980s, up to around 1989, 1990, he was basically what I can say a lone voice in Zimbabwean political theater. Whereas the Pungwe was a critical theatrical performance during the colonial period. We suffered like what South Africa did after attaining independence in 1984, where theater makers did not know what to do. They used to perform under apartheid plays, and now apartheid was dismantled. What next? So this happened with the Pungwe, with most of our theater clubs in the early 80s, early to late 80s. But Conde Mhlanga found that voice early on in his theater career.
And he went on to his theater, the Maposa theater still survives, right? And he's generated a lot of other theaters that were inspired by him.
Yes, so Conde Mhlanga was the first Black Zimbabwean or independent theater person who built a cultural center in Zimbabwe. in the 1990s. The land was donated by the Bulawayo City Council, and he raised resources to finance the building of the center, which is still there now. And I'm not sure whether his daughter is now running the center, but before his death, there were other young people that he trained who were running the center. He had actually retreated from theater into and transcended into radio and television. So he co-owned a radio station in Bulawayo again, and were given last year a license to start a television station when the government gave out 6 television licenses to different people in the country. So he was lucky to have been part of the people who were given that license
Yes.
for televisions. So Amakos is still surviving. I think they are supposed to be performing in Harare from tomorrow. Yes.
Great. So that this has been fascinating. It's so rich, the history of theater in Zimbabwe. We could go on and on with it, but I know that I and most of the people here came to hear more about your theater and your work. So let's shift to that. Savanna Trust, which you founded and which you have led for decades, is one of the most active and influential political theaters in Zimbabwe today. So I have a whole series of questions about it and you, because it's you and the theater are very intertwined. So maybe we could start with you briefly telling us how you first became interested in theater.
Oh, I'm always truthful about this. I never did theater school. I never thought of becoming a theater practitioner. I always say it was by accident. And that accident happened when I was looking for a job after school, but I had an interest in music. So I went to a music college to see how they do it. And guess what? There were auditions going on. And I succeeded in the auditions. I didn't even know what acting was. But my introduction to theater was through a play that was talking about how bad the economic structural adjustment programs that were being introduced in Zimbabwe by the IMF and the World Bank were there. So it was called Moneyland. And I also was not very politically conscious at that age. You know, what we were interested more was to get jobs. And unfortunately, and coincidentally, we were the first young people in 1992 who were affected by the economic structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and the IMF, where there were massive retrenchments in the country. Job opportunities became less and less. So I found myself being hooked in theater. And coincidentally, my introduction into theater was through this play, which was a protest play against the IMF and the World Bank, and also against the government for agreeing to take up these programs.
Right.
After that, I then linked up with guys from Zambuko Izibuko who were coming to direct us. Some of them were young, coming out of university, and we started working together. And also my political consciousness was brought up. While we would do other entertainment plays, I then found out that I loved more plays that talked about the day-to-day issues affecting especially young people in Zimbabwe at that time. So that was my introduction to theater. And then I was an actor and went on to acquire different skills, not through going to college, but through performing. I learned how to write, I learned how to direct. I also learned how to produce practically in the rehearsal room, rather than going to school for it. So that was my early introduction into theater. And then we began to become popular with political theater. So we started being hired by NGOs to perform plays during their workshops and the like. And then we took that advantage to learn about issues of rights, issues of politics, issues of democracy, issues of justice through these trainings offered by non-governmental organizations in Zimbabwe. So I then fell in love with this kind of theater. But also in my formative years, I started visiting Amakos Theatre. I started visiting other sprouting theater organizations in the country. And in the 1990s, you realize that the more theater clubs that were frustrated by the government began to produce political plays. And that is how my theater history began. And around 2006, after working in different theater organizations and also running a theater club for quite some time, we then transformed Savanna Trust into a trust. And one of the things that we did, because before that we would do political theater plays, we would do educational plays, we would do social plays, we then decided to focus on certain issues, and our focus was basically on human rights and how the regime was oppressing the Zimbabwean citizens. So we began producing hard-hitting political plays. But then you would realize that as we progressed, the government became very critical and heavy-handed on theater, as they realized that we were then becoming a critical voice in society. They also began to harass performers, to harass producers, to harass directors. So you would find that there were no longer spaces in communities for us to perform. That is when we decided to come up with a strategy, which was the hit and run theater, where we would just go to a township or to a shopping center or to a place to a market where people are gathered. We perform a 10 to 15-minute production, making people aware of the issues that are happening in their communities, encouraging people to vote, encouraging people to participate in political processes in their communities. And then before the police would know about it, would have left the place. So it became a lot more of a guerrilla kind of theater process. So we didn't need to advertise it. We would just get at the center and do our small act and then leave. So yeah, those were the formative years.
Yeah, that's when that's when I met you, and I was very impressed with how you would gather a crowd in the city and with song and dance, and then once the crowd was there, you'd put on the play that had something to say, and then you'd disappear into when the police started to come.
Yes, and this kind of play was more of agit-prop. So we created sort of two-way kind of producing and performing our art. This was the hit and run theater, which happens mostly in politically have communities or politically polarized communities. And on the other side, we dealt a lot, and we still deal a lot with communities, trying to educate them on their rights, trying to mobilize them to participate in political processes, in governance processes, and in many other processes of national importance. So this one is particularly focused to rural communities, trying to encourage women to be critical about governance issues and trying to mobilize young people to be active participants in governance processes at a micro level in their communities. So this is one avenue that we use our plays for, besides the heavy political plays that we produce. Yes.
Yes, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing now in the villages, the interactive theater that's in a sense, what you're going beyond the polarization of agitprop to getting people involved in engaging the issues they have to engage. And for everybody, for our students, I know in the listing it said this was an hour, but we're obviously going to go a little longer. So please, if you can, stick with us because we want to hear from you as well. So Daniel, maybe you could give us a brief view of what Savanna Trust is doing now and why you've decided to move in that direction.
Do I have time just to show a short clip about our rural intervention? Okay.
So we're going to see a short clip of their work that's going on now.
Daniel, we don't hear any audio. Is it possible to maybe adjust yours?
Well, even without the audio, I think we got a good sense of the environment in which you perform. But tell us a little more about it.
Yeah, so what we do is we go into the community. We also have a multi-pronged process. One of the process is that we train local community theater artists in the villages. And then they produce the plays within their communities. So we facilitate the production of the plays. What we give them are the skills and the information on the subject that they want to tackle. So this particular one was a local governance production where we're encouraging people to hold their leaders to account. So when the artists produce, they pre-test the production in their communities, and then they mobilize their communities at a community center, and then they perform for the community. So we then don't export actors from outside of the village. We capacitate local actors to identify their issues. And when they identify their issues, they then produce a play that speaks to their issues. And you then realize that mobilization becomes very easy. So in a way, it is also a borrowing from the Pungwe aspect, from the Pungwe theater of the liberation struggle, where there is community involvement in the creation of messages, in the prioritization of messages, and also in the performances. So when people see young people from their communities performing, and sometimes these are young people who had nothing to do, who would roam around townships, and now they are performing, they have these skills, they will definitely attend the performances. So we co-create with the community. The community owns the performance process. The community owns the messages, and the community owns the discussions, because after the performance, they then carry out discussions on the issues that come out of the play, like a theater development process. And also they can break the community members into focus groups, into different groups, where then they begin to prioritize action points on how they can tackle a certain issue. So this in brief is our process when we are dealing with communities. We rarely go in as professional actors from Harare to perform for people in a certain village 100 kilometers away from Harare, but we identify local community artists who we then capacitate with theater skills. We enhance their skills if they already were performing, and then we also capacitate them to become vibrant and sustainable theater groups in their own communities. So as Savanna Trust, we've also managed to sustain and to develop the skills of many other local community theater groups around Zimbabwe. More than 15, if I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
So this is in brief our process, but also one of the major processes that we do now in the communities is, if, for example, we are dealing with a water shortage issue, we bring in duty bearers or local government or elected councillors from that particular district or village to begin to engage their communities, to answer to questions that communities are asking. So that's how we then tackle the community problems. That's how we tackle issues of violence, of political violence in communities. That is how we encourage peace within our communities. That is how we tackle even issues of gender-based violence in our communities. So we encourage the community members and their leadership to interface so that they can solve their own problems.
Beautiful. That's one of the things that I find so exciting about your work, is that in a sense you qualitatively move from didactic theater, which is the actors teaching the audience, to a collective process by which the audience itself identifies, explores, comes up with answers and questions on its own and performs them. And that's why, in my mind, you have moved through the porous border between theater and what I call performance activism. So I think your work is a beautiful example of that. Unfortunately, time is running through our fingers like sand through anyway, it's going fast. So I want to pause here and see if anyone in any of our students and those who are listening have questions for Daniel at this point about his work or about Zimbabwean theater in general. Okay, it looks like Zion. And Zion, am I reading your sign? You're in Greece?
No.
Oh, in Greensboro. Okay. Yeah. I just saw GREE. Greensboro, North Carolina.
I'm not in Greece. As I understand it, political theater is about, like change on a larger scale. And now I know Daniel's history with it. But I was wondering how political theater has shaped you, Daniel, on a more emotional or personal level, like what values you've taken away from it, for example.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question that really focuses on the individual. Let me say, from our context, is it my video?
No, you're fine.
Oh, I'm fine. Okay.
Yes.
From our context, and from a personal point of view, my involvement with political theater made me begin to appreciate and to understand rights, to also appreciate and to understand our diversity as a people, but also from a justice point of view, to have that commitment to say that I will not keep quiet when I see an injustice being done. Probably I will not do it in a way that most activists do, but probably I will do it through a performance. I will do it through an article in a newspaper, or another way. But I began to appreciate the need for diversity, for coexistence, but in a paternalistic and patriarchal society as Zimbabwe, to begin to also appreciate issues of inclusion. All this stemming from the aspect that as citizens of the world, we are the same. We aspire for one thing, freedom, and we also aspire for a good life that we all enjoy. We also aspire for a free society that gives us a conducive environment to achieve our dreams. So political theater has put me on that pedestal to say, what are the important aspects in life, in society, and as an individual?
Beautiful. That might be a great place to stop, but we can have one more or two more questions. They're very brief. But if not, that is a beautiful place to stop because it brings the political and the personal together in a very organic way. So thank you, Daniel. This has been a beautiful conversation. And Omar, I want to hand it over to you to sort of pull it all together for us.
Yeah, let's give a round of applause to our Daniels, especially our Daniel coming all the way from Zimbabwe. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful follow-up question, Zion. Really appreciate that. You know, this has been a very good historical, political, theatrical conversation, and it's just an honor to be trying out these things from different parts of the world together in terms of using performativity to help people develop and grow, and everything that you said in your closing statement, Daniel. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and thank you all for being here, and Dan for this conversation. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and we'll be in touch electronically. Take care, everybody. Very nice to meet you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Omar.
There were many comments in the chat, just so you know, saying thank you so much.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah, I'll need a chat with you and Dan.
Yeah. Do you want to stay on, Dan and Daniel?
Yes.
Okay. Good. We recorded this, so I'm going to stop the recording here. And